We have 3 vaccines that have been authorized by the FDA for emergency use in the United States. Those COVID vaccines are Pfizer, Moderna, and Johnson & Johnson. So which vaccine is the best vaccine? Well, I recommend the Johnson & Johnson vaccine to those who trust the science and the math behind the clinical trials, and those who want to get vaccinated as soon as possible, especially if they just want a single dose and a very low chance of getting side effects. I would recommend the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccine to those who feel more comfortable with higher efficacy rates and to those who have ethical concerns about how the vaccine was made. It's hard to compare the 3 vaccines since they were all studied with slightly different populations, they were all measured slightly differently, and they were all studied at different times during this pandemic. For example, the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccine were studied when the COVID variants were not prevalent, while the Johnson & Johnson, also known as the Janssen vaccine, was studied in the presence of COVID variants. In order to make head-to-head comparisons, we need head-to-head vaccine trials, but unfortunately we don't have those, so that's why it's hard to compare the 3 vaccines. But let's talk about what we do know. The Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines are mRNA vaccines, while the Johnson vaccine is a viral vector vaccine. All 3 vaccines stimulate the body to generate antibodies and to develop active immunity against COVID. And all 3 vaccines have 100% efficacy against COVID hospitalization and death. The Pfizer vaccine requires 2 doses 21 days apart. The Moderna vaccine requires 2 doses 28 days apart. And the good news is that the Johnson & Johnson vaccine only requires 1 single dose. Okay? So what's the infection risk? The infection risk is the percentage of people who developed COVID symptoms after vaccination. The infection risk for Pfizer is 0.045%. That means that only 8 people out of 17,411 people who were vaccinated with the Pfizer vaccine developed symptomatic COVID. Now, the Moderna vaccine has an infection risk of 0.077% in their trials. That means that only 11 out of 14,134 people who were vaccinated with the Moderna vaccine had symptomatic COVID. Okay, now what about the Johnson & Johnson vaccine? Well, that has an infection risk of 0.344% in their vaccine trials. That means that only 66 people out of 19,178 people who were vaccinated with the Johnson vaccine had symptomatic COVID. Okay, so the infection risk was low across the board. It's lowest with the Pfizer vaccine, but even the Johnson & Johnson vaccine has a very low infection risk. Now let's talk about the vaccine efficacy against mild COVID disease. So if you decide to get vaccinated with the Pfizer vaccine, 1 week after the second dose, there's a 95% less risk of developing any COVID symptom when compared to someone who was never vaccinated, okay? If you decide to get vaccinated with the Moderna vaccine 2 weeks after the second dose, you'll have a 94.1% less risk of developing 2 or more COVID-19 symptoms than someone who was never vaccinated. And if you decide to get vaccinated with the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, 28 days after that single dose, you'll have a 66% less risk of developing moderate to severe disease than someone who was never vaccinated. And moderate to severe disease is defined as someone who has pneumonia, DVT, shortness of breath, or 2 or more systemic COVID symptoms such as fevers, chills, nausea, vomiting, loss of taste, loss of smell. So what about protection from variants? Well, they all appear to have some degree of protection against the new variants. In the case of the Pfizer vaccine, in the laboratory studies, they found that the Pfizer vaccine appears to maintain neutralizing activity against the UK variant, and the Moderna vaccine also appears to maintain neutralizing activity against the UK variant. However, the South Africa variant may reduce antibody protection from the Pfizer vaccine by 2/3. And the South Africa variant may reduce the antibody protection from the Moderna vaccine by 6-fold, okay? Where the good news is that the Johnson & Johnson vaccine was studied in the presence of COVID variants. It has a 72% efficacy in the United States and a 64% efficacy in South Africa and a 68.1% efficacy in Brazil. All 3 vaccines provide some degree of protection against the COVID-19 variants, including the New York strain known as the B.1.526, which originated in Manhattan in February. The side effect profile for all 3 vaccines is very similar. They can all cause local injection site reactions such as pain, swelling, and redness around the arm, and they can all cause systemic symptoms such as fevers, chills, fatigue, muscle aches, and headaches. And unfortunately, adverse effects are going to be common, especially in younger people. But that makes sense. It's inconvenient, but it makes sense. You would expect younger people to develop stronger immune responses to the vaccines. Now, the most common side effects actually differs between vaccines. So, for example, in the Pfizer vaccine, fatigue and headache were the most common symptoms after the second dose. In the Moderna vaccine, fevers, chills, and myalgias were the most common symptoms after the second dose. In the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, headache, fatigue, myalgia, nausea, and fever were common after the single dose. Guess which one had the lowest percentage of reported side effects? The Johnson & Johnson vaccine had the lowest percentage of reported side effects. Let's talk about the ethical concerns regarding these new vaccines. Let me make this clear. None of the COVID-19 vaccines use fetal cells from recent abortions, and none of the new COVID-19 vaccines inject aborted cells inside of you. That's just nonsense. However, these new vaccines do use cells that originated from an elective abortion that took place in the Netherlands more than 30 years ago, and these cells are used in various phases of the vaccine development. In the case of the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines, aborted-derived fetal cell lines were used only in the confirmatory testing phase, and they were not used in the development and the production of the vaccine. So a group of conservative scientists at the Lazier Institute stated that the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccine are ethically uncontroversial. The Christian Medical and Dental Association stated that Christians can receive the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccine in good conscience, and the Catholic Medical Association and the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith stated that the use of the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccine are justified. In the case of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, aborted-derived fetal cells were used in the development, production, and the confirmatory testing phase of the vaccine. The Lazier Institute deemed the Johnson & Johnson vaccine as unethical. The Christian Medical Dental Association deemed this new vaccine as concerning and controversial, and the Catholic Medical Association and the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith deemed this vaccine as morally compromised. It's hard to compare these three vaccines, as a head-to-head vaccine trial is needed to determine which vaccine has the best efficacy. The good news is that all three vaccines protect against hospitalization and death, and all three vaccines offer some degree of protection against the COVID variants. The advantages of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine is that it's a single dose with a very low probability of getting side effects. The advantages of the Moderna and the Pfizer vaccine is that they have high efficacy rates and are ethically uncontroversial. I recommend the Johnson & Johnson vaccine to those who trust the science and the math behind the vaccine trials, to those who want to get vaccinated as soon as possible and only want a single dose and a very low chance of getting side effects. I would recommend the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccine to those who feel more comfortable with the higher efficacy rates, and to those who have ethical concerns about how the vaccines were made. My name is Dr. TomTom, and I hope that this video helps you in your decision-making process. Please like, share, and subscribe.